the future of the country actually relies upon a modus operandi being developed between those two parties. So I just hope that maturity and sanity prevails in the end.
Can the opposition put aside its differences and work together to dislodge the ANC? This is a question that I posed to Toby Chance in a recent episode of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. What follows is a short extract from our longer conversation. If you would like to watch the full interview with Toby Chance, that's linked in the description below. Enjoy.
But you see, in my view, that's not going to happen with the current government because it's hardwired into their method of doing things. Patronage, preferential, not just procurement, but everything. Preferencing a small group of increasingly wealthy and disconnected cadres. The chances of that changing within the current regime are virtually nil, in my view.
All right. Well, I think that sets us up for a discussion around political realignment, Toby. I mean, you've been involved in opposition politics for a large part of your career, and it seems like the ANC's hegemony is beginning to weaken and crumble. It's not quite dead yet, but seems to be dying. And there's this interregnum, if you will. Antonio Gramsci, the Marxist political theorist, said that the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born. I think that describes perfectly where we are at the moment in South Africa. So what do you think are the prospects for this grand political realignment, and what would that look like?
One of the problems with that in South Africa is our political system, which is dominated by parties as opposed to individuals. And that is a big constraint because whilst a parliament is sitting, it's very difficult to have the major players realigning themselves so as to be ready for an election when they might be able to form a new entity. Whereas that wouldn't be the case, for example, in a country where you had either a more fluid political system or where you had constituencies where essentially an MP would be able to make his own mind up with the support, admittedly, of his constituency association. I think that there is a real need for political realignment, and I think the public are calling for it. But whether it's going to happen in a smooth transition in this country is, I think, in question. The real issue, I think, is whether the opposition parties that are grouping around a certain set of policies which could form an alternative government have the maturity to sit around the table and decide that they are going to work together as opposed to sniping at each other. And also whether the ANC goes sufficiently below 50% in the next election to force a new alignment. In other words, they won't be able to, let's say, go into power with a couple of the minnows or maybe the EFF. So I think for a real political realignment to happen, you either have to have a split in the ANC, which I think is 50-50. I can't see that as being a necessary outcome. Or we have to see the ANC going below 40% at least in the next election. So I think all efforts must be made in the next 24 months or less by parties such as the DA, ActionSA, UDM, and others to realize that this is an existential crisis facing the country, and that they have a massive responsibility to sit around and knock their heads together and realign in a way which takes the country in a different direction.
Right, Toby. Well, I think that I absolutely agree with you. But whenever I open Twitter on my phone, I see some spat breaking out between the DA and ActionSA, and I'm sure it's very important to them that they score points against one another. But I wonder what the electorate thinks of this fighting.
Yes. On that question, I would say that ActionSA is more the guilty party in terms of initiating the spats than the DA. I think the DA has been quite scrupulous in the last 9 to 12 months in trying to avoid making extempore and ad hominem attacks on ActionSA, because they realize that the future of the country actually relies upon a modus operandi being developed between those two parties. So I just hope that maturity and sanity prevails in the end.
Yeah, and I think there are a few areas of policy difference, but in many ways the parties are quite similar. And I think it reminds me of what Sigmund Freud used to say, the narcissism of small difference, that essentially they're kind of competing in a way for the same turf as being the standard bearer of the opposition. Meanwhile, the real opponent really should be the ANC and all of its destructive policies. But, I think your earlier example of the city of Cape Town, this kind of motley crew of coalition partners, that actually enabled the city under Helen Zille's leadership to say, okay, well, here is an alternative way of doing things. Once the electorate could see that in action, they then ended up going with the DA more wholly and more thoroughly. So, I mean, do you think that that's a potential outcome that we could see here? I mean, Joburg and Tshwane seem to be managing. There's a lot of service delivery issues, but there seems to be holding it together.
I think if we go back to 2006, the coalition in Cape Town comprised 6 or 7 parties, and after a while, the ID merged with the DA to give the DA effectively a majority. I think that the likelihood in Joburg of that happening is less, because you have more parties competing that have a greater share of the vote. So I think whilst the DA is obviously aiming to become the majority party in Gauteng, I think it's got to face up to the fact that that is an unlikely prospect, and that they have to be prepared to sit around the table with other parties to achieve a majority, which is why those relationships have to be cultivated very, very closely. And I really hope that the personal antagonisms that exist between certain leaders can be set aside. In place of that, a more collaborative approach is developed.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that many of the ActionSA staffers are former DA members themselves. And so whereas they might have in the past formed part of an internal faction within the DA kind of warring for influence, now that faction has kind of almost been externalized, and now these conflicts are in full view in the public domain. There's no kind of pressure release valve.
It's sad that those historical antagonisms are still influencing current behaviors. And I think if that can be set aside, and as you say, the real enemy is seen categorically as the ANC, then hopefully that those set of antagonisms can be set aside.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, why don't you check out the full interview with Toby Chance? That's linked over here. You can also check out my other channel. That's linked over here. My name is David Ansara. This is the CRA. Until next time, take care.